And it's me, the Nazarite, bringing you Hebrew lore from days of yore. And in this week's installment of Random Rants, Musings, and Thoughts and Stuff, that's the other title of this weekly series. Anyway, let's talk about Passover. Let's talk about the spring. Passover in the Hebrew faith has 4 names, one of them being the Festival of Spring. Like other Hebrew festivals, it goes with the seasons, with agricultural, different times of agriculture, harvest, and planting and whatnot. Things that I have little to do with in the agricultural sense, but a lot to do with in the mental or spiritual sense, or sometimes physically. So, the holiday of springtime, rejuvenation, and Passover is all about liberty and freedom and breaking away from the bonds that are keeping you enslaved. It's important to note that when Jacob and his sons first went to Egypt, Joseph aside, they willingly went there. First, because there was a famine going on in the land of Canaan, but even afterwards, the children of Israel stayed there for several centuries. Before they were enslaved, they had been there for a while, several centuries overall, and they went there willingly, but then they became enslaved. And there are many questions as to why didn't they do something? They were a lot of people. I won't get into that. Point is, sometimes we go into these traps willingly. They look like one thing, they become another. And sometimes we make bad decisions, and sometimes those become habits, and sometimes we have difficulties breaking away from things that we find to be comforting, familiar, and a part of our life. So, our sages teach us that in every generation, an individual should see himself as if he or she came out of Egypt right then and there. It's as if to say, it's not that your forefathers were under the yoke of the Egyptians and were freed, and that's it. That yoke of Egypt is like energy; it keeps on shifting and changing forms and ways of manifesting in the world. So Egypt, as a concept of something that keeps you in bondage, is never truly outside of your life, outside of the world. We are all slaves to something. The ideal being, as far as the Hebrew faith is concerned, to be a slave to God. And I do the quotations because it's not as if you have a master, but in your thought it could be, and in the way you conduct yourself. Right? The Lord is above any kind of thought or imagination. But we use these analogies and figurative speech, master, slave. It's all about a lot of Pesach, and liberation of oneself has to do with submission and dominance, giving the right thing its right time, its right place. So our sages teach us that we are all meant to think of ourselves as if we ourselves came out of Egypt, because in reality, that's what we're shooting for as well. Back then, they were doing it as a people, and now we're doing it as individuals, which is why it is a commandment to pass on the story of Passover from father to son, from mother to daughter, right? From generation to generation, because it always exists in some form or another. As individuals, as a people, there are always things that are holding you back. So a poet by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said, and I'm paraphrasing like on the fly, translating on the fly, the slaves of time, and I think I mentioned this in a separate video, the slaves of time are slaves, and the slaves of God are free. Therefore, when I ask what it is that I desire, let God be my, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't remember. But let God be where I lay my head, said my soul. That's pretty much what he says there. So when we become enslaved and in bondage, having to do with material things, it's something which is here today and gone tomorrow, much like ourselves. And it's nothing that will give you sustainable freedom over a long period of time, over like a life. you may think it is and it isn't really, or freedom is a tricky issue. And we each have our own subjective and individual definition of what that freedom is, which is precisely why we each can see ourselves as if it is us who came out of Egypt, because we each have our own definition of what it is that is keeping us enslaved and what it would mean to be free of it. So every year I take this time to consider what it is that I am enslaved to in this life, at this time in my life. Nothing I'm going to open up right now, although I'm not ruling it out in the future. But I bring it up because the way that the children of Israel got out of bondage was, first of all, when they called out and their cry was heard by the Almighty, they were not crying out to the Almighty. They were simply crying out because they were so sick and tired of the tasks and the assignments and the yoke that they were, that they were carrying. They were done doing the dirty work for the Egyptians. They were done working hard. I mean, slave labor. It's called slave labor for a reason. It was just human death and suffering for a long period of time. And they called out. And it wasn't that they called out to God, but God heard them, it says. There's a progression there, right? He heard, he saw, he heard, he looked, he saw, he knew. Something to that effect, where there's a progression in how God perceived what was going on there. Sending Moses, someone from the outside, eventually they were freed with great miracles and all kinds of, sorcery and bending the laws of nature. That's something that God did it back then, the 10 plagues. But in this day and age, in order to be free, it is us who need to bend our own nature. It's not that God does something. Well, God, I'm getting ahead of myself as far as what God, is. I'll put a link down there. There's another video. Always a good thing to watch that one. I need to keep reminding myself that God is my God, a subjective God. The point I'm trying to make is that back then it was 10 plagues, right? And God doing all the work, so to speak, and the Israelites simply sitting it out. And in this day and age, if you want to be free of something, it's your own nature that you need to bend. You need to be able to harness that divine energy that is unique in this day, in these days of Passover, and be able to become rejuvenated and spring forward in the spirit of this holiday, this festival, and this season. Spring is an amazing time, right? Things are blooming, the whole biological, physical, material world that I can see out the window now. It's all starting to bloom. It's a wonderful thing. So we need to figure out, as people and as, nations, as places, and as a human race, what is it that we are enslaved to? What is it that is keeping us from being free? What is that freedom? What is it that constitutes freedom? Right? We need to ask those Aristotelian questions of what is beauty? What is truth? What is freedom? What is liberty to me? What does it mean? And what Rabbi Yehuda Levi said, that only a slave of the Almighty is free, I find that to be true in more ways than spirituality. I saw this in me, in my screenwriting and my writing generally, because I also wrote poetry. Haven't for a while, but I also did that. By giving yourself boundaries, you're able to be free. In other words, it's not that the Israelites went out of the bondage of Egypt into freedom and nihilism. They went on from one bondage and into another. The difference is that one they chose wholeheartedly, the bondage with the Lord. And bonding is more than just a slave and a master. But again, the dominance and submission thing is very crucial. But it is through submission to the Almighty, to the Most High, that we are able to dominate our destiny, our future. I was rereading parts of the Tao Te Ching earlier today, well, this week. And one of the things he says there is, and it's a Hebrew translation, and I'll translate it into English on the fly, and he says, Let me think. Oh, wow, it just escaped my mind. It'll come to me. I made that whole thing. Right. He says, know the most ancient, and you will be able to master the present. So over there, he's talking about the Tao, and he's talking about the way, and where the way came from, which I attribute to God. And he's saying, if you go back to the root of things, you will be able to control your motion and movement in this time. Egypt is going back to our roots as a people. Passover is going back to our roots as far as what it means to be saved. I know a lot of Christians talk of being saved as far as making that leap of faith, right, and accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior. I am not planning on taking that particular leap of faith, but, and I explained my views on Jesus in a different video, I think, or my one take on it, and my quick take on it. But to be free is not simply to do whatever you want. There is that freedom for sure, and it is a freedom. But I think the greater freedom is choosing your yoke, choosing your burden, because it is through acceptance of a burden and of responsibility that you can experience truer freedom, one that is more real, one that you attain. Like there's something there that's very visceral and very mentally freeing. So when you choose to leave Egypt's rule and accept the rule of the Most High and take him, take the divine into your heart and into your daily conduct, it's something that brings with it freedom in spite of all the rules and regulations and laws. And like I said in a previous video, I pick and choose what laws to follow. I'm a total cafeteria man of faith. I pick and choose what's important to me. What's important to me with Passover is to pass it on to my kids. The story of Passover. There are people who say it never happened. It's all metaphor. It's all figurative. Never happened. Fine. Let's explore that for a brief minute, and then I'll end with this. Let's say it didn't happen. Is there not a lot that can be learned for positive and negative, in a positive and negative light? Isn't there a lot we can take away from the story as it appears in the Bible? I mean, there is a lot about the Exodus from Egypt and the whole progression of the plagues and the way it came about. We can do amazing things if we not bend our will to something we don't want, because that's not sustainable, but to be able to orient ourselves properly, and in a way of righteousness and truth and justice that we define as what we consider to be truth and justice and righteousness. And if we're able to do that, if we're able to bend ourselves even only sporadically, even badly, wrongly at first, but have that in our minds that that is what we want, that is a goal, we will eventually be able to muster enough strength, enough courage, enough fortitude to make that happen, to break our bonds, not to be free, but to enter different bonds that we once again willingly accept. And in doing so, we learn what true freedom is. Because I only think, at least for me personally, that's the only type of freedom that I really connected with on a very intimate level. And other types of freedom of I'll do whatever I want, I mean, there are degrees of this, of course, it's a wide spectrum, but there were times where it didn't sit right with me. Whereas accepting the yoke of a responsibility, it always has, even if it has its difficulties, and it most certainly does. The acceptance of responsibility carries with it a lot of difficulties, however you look at it. But it's something that's worthwhile if you choose something that you really are willing to take on. The people of Israel were willing to come out of Egypt into the unknown, into the desert, and once they were there, it took a long time to become a people and to go through a lot and end up for 40 years lost in the desert and then make it to the promised land with Moses, the one who led them, to tragically be left out. More on that another time. For now, I will see you in a couple of days for the weekly portion and Passover. Let's have a wonderful evening. God bless.